Many of us believe that aid to Africa is crucial to lift people out of poverty, but not Dambisa Moyo. In a controversial new book, she argues that foreign aid has been a disaster for Africa and must stop. Moyo was born and raised in Zambia, but educated at Oxford and Harvard. She's worked for both the World Bank and Goldman Sachs. Her book is called Dead Aid. In the West, it's been drummed into us that we have a moral responsibility to provide more aid to Africa. Now, in your new book, you start from the premise that not only is aid not a solution, it in fact is part of the problem. Explain that general thesis for me.
The problem is that it is malignant, and the book basically outlines the many reasons why it is that aid has failed to deliver on its original promises. So let me just take you a little bit back in history as to what the origins of the aid model are. So the 1950s and 60s were a time when many African countries in particular, but emerging countries in general, were coming out of a colonial period. And at this time, there was literature in the economics space by people such as Chenery and Strout in the 1966 paper, where they basically identified a very simple equation that savings would lead to investment and investment would lead to growth. But the argument at that time was that in poor countries there was no savings because these were newly formed countries that didn't have the requisite savings that could lead to investment and therefore lead to growth. So basically policymakers at the time said instead of savings we'll use aid, and the aid would
that would
fuel
become the
investment.
surrogate for the savings.
Correct. And aid would lead to investment and that would lead to growth. And the idea was that you would get not only growth, but you would have an alleviation of poverty, because with growth you could then move people out of poverty. But if you look back over the past 60 years, where Africa's received over $1 trillion of aid, the issue then becomes, on those two metrics, growth and poverty, have things improved? And the answer is a resounding no. It's
actually, your point is gone backwards since the 70s. Per capita income's down like 70%.
That's exactly right.
Just explain that to me, because I mean, that seems $1 trillion gone, essentially.
Basically,
and,
yes.
And poverty more entrenched now than before.
Absolutely. And just to illustrate, in the 1970s, 10% of Africans lived on $1 a day. Now over 70% of Africans are living on $1 a day. So things have got fundamentally worse. And if you look at growth, again, Africa, to quote Paul Collier, who's my PhD supervisor, Africa is actually shearing off. So things are getting worse. When the rest of the world is moving in one direction, Africa is going in a completely different direction.
Basically, you're saying, look, what we should be doing in the Western world is giving African countries notice. 5 years and the aid tap is turned off. How would that work?
Well, first of all, with respect to the 5 years, it was an example in the book, and I think it's really important not to focus on that number of 5 years. I mean, obviously, we can't have a blanket prescription for all countries. They're very different levels of economic development. Zambia, my own country, is very different from Ghana, very different from Somalia, which is a failed state. So I think to focus on the 5 years per se is to miss the broader point that we do need a finite, transparent exit strategy. The aid programs that have worked, the Green Revolution in India, or the interventions in South Korea, or the aid interventions through the Marshall Plan, have worked, I believe, because they were finite. They were short, sharp, and finite, as opposed to the open-ended commitments that we see in Africa, where governments start to view aid income as permanent income, and therefore do not need to seek alternative ways of financing economic development. And so how would it work? Well, I think we can actually start to think now about how we exit. What sort of things need to be done to actually encourage and foster the other things like trade and foreign direct investment, like the capital markets, to start thinking about how we replace the aid model. And there's a lot of scope for that. I mean, in many African countries, it can take up to 2 years to get a business license. This is not, to me, a suggestion that these are governments that want to see private sector develop.
So you'd think that simply by putting these governments on notice, they would have a salutary effect in its own right?
I think it would be. I think if we start saying credibly, and in a way the credit crisis has done that, with America facing 10% unemployment, with Germany facing a 6% GDP contraction this year, countries are just not going to have money. I mean, as I said, the United States is already borrowing from China to sustain itself. It makes no sense for the United States to borrow from China to give Africa aid. There is going to be a contraction in capital, and the United States is going to need to focus on its own people. With 10% unemployment rates, people losing their jobs in the auto industry, people in the United States will demand of their presidency and their administration that they focus on domestic issues.
When we talk about aid, what kind of aid we're talking about? This is not me giving $50 to UNICEF. You're talking mostly of agency to agency or government to government.
That's exactly right, and that's a very important. It's an important point, because essentially there are three types of aid. The first type of aid is humanitarian aid, and I believe that's the sort of aid that would go towards a tsunami or an earthquake or a flood. And I believe that there is a moral imperative as human beings and being part of a global community that we do act when those type of emergencies occur. So the book is not about that type of aid. The second type of aid is what you've just alluded to. It's the relatively small amounts of money that wealthy people might send to support a charity or an NGO to support a girl going to school in Africa. And I think it's important for us, I myself, by the way, sit on a number of boards that do this type of charitable intervention, but let's understand what that type of intervention can and cannot do. It can send a girl to school, for example, but it will never make these economies grow at the requisite levels of growth so we can meaningfully put a dent in poverty. And so it may be a good idea in the short term, but it's not going to help in the long term. And I very much view those type of interventions as Band-Aid solutions. And you're right, the third type of aid is really the big billion-dollar government-to-government packages. But I think the fundamental point, going back to your original question about why it is that we're in this situation, what the links are exactly, why it is that so much money has not been able to generate growth, it's simply because there, of course, are a whole list of reasons. But if you think about the worst-case scenario, that the money is actually being used for corrupt purposes, which even today, it's still contributing to graft and rent-seeking. My own former president, where I'm from Zambia, is embroiled in a scandal right now of stealing lots of money. Also, the former president of Malawi is also, as we speak, in the middle of a court case for stealing money. So this is still something that's very much part of the aid culture. But that's only one side. On the other extreme, the aid system allows African governments to abdicate their responsibilities of providing public goods.
And it distorts local economies.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a whole host of things. It kills entrepreneurship. If you think about...
No need for a middle class.
Absolutely. And in fact, if you think about what I call the reverse Boston Tea Party, we're in a situation in Africa where we get no representation without taxation. So African governments are not representing the wants of the African people because they're not taxing us. They don't need to act on our behalf because somebody else is paying.
And I feel no obligation really to hold you accountable because you don't have my money.
Correct.
You call this rent money.
Yes. It's in economics literature. These relatively easy payments or easy cash are called rents, and so rent seeking is simply another way of talking about graft or corruption.
Now you have a very interesting background. You made reference already. You were born in Zambia.
Yes.
Went on to humble educational institutions like Harvard and Oxford, getting a PhD. Then went to work for the World Bank and then Goldman Sachs.
That's right.
When did you come to this conclusion? What was it that made you come saying, this isn't the solution, this is the problem. Aid is a real problem here.
I think the artifacts of aid, things like corruption and bureaucracy and inflation and the fact that Africans are disenfranchised, is something that many Africans grow up with. And I think I only really started to realize that there was one economics model for developed countries and the most rapidly emerging countries like China, Russia, India, even South Africa and Brazil. And a completely different model for Africa when I first came to the United States in North America to do my studies at Harvard and then subsequently to do my doctorate at Oxford. And it's quite disheartening to work in international organizations and to see relatively few Africans. And then you start to ask the question, where are the Africans? Why do we find people in international organizations from all around the world? And you very rarely see Africans in these places. And then you do realize that there's something fundamentally is going wrong. And I spent a lot of time researching this issue. My PhD thesis was looking at savings behavior and how countries actually achieve long-term growth. I feel very privileged to be born and to live in this period because we've also seen China move 300 million people out of poverty.
And you also make the point that Africa itself has become, in your words, addicted to aid.
That's right.
How did that occur? What does that mean?
That has occurred over time, and there are a few countries that voted with their feet or managed to escape the drug. South Africa, for example, and Botswana both have not been dependent on aid to the degree that most Africans turned it down, and they've gone what I would consider the road less traveled. In other words, going to the capital markets, and we'll talk about some of these ideas.
Yes, for sure.
Point. Unfortunately, it's really, the addiction has grown over time, to the point now that a number of African countries, for example, Rwanda, over 70% of the government's budget is aid dependent, it's aid sourced. And it's a great tragedy because with that comes the ossification of the civil service and the bureaucracy, and the fact that there is really no incentive to seek better alternative ways of financing economic development.
And you obviously linked this, you touched on this, but I want to get into a little bit more depth. Also, this culture or addiction to aid, linking it directly to a lot of the corruption we see in government in Africa. And this just outright theft is.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's completely accepted and supported. I mean, the most egregious forms of it, of course, are the people like Mobutu of Africa's yesteryear. But it's still happening today. Governments across the continent, not all of them, but a great number of them are very happy to take money. And of course, it also, I think people don't understand this, there are clear linkages to the fact that we have a lot of civil unrest in Africa because the real source of cash on the continent is being in charge of the state. If you capture the state, you then have access to capital. So in other words, it's no surprise that Africa for the past 6 months has had 4 coups, Guinea-Bissau, Mauritania, and Madagascar, or the fact that in the 1990s Africa had more civil unrest than the rest of the world put together.
A lot of the conscious raising around aid to Africa and our humanitarian and moral obligations to the continent has come from rock stars, Bob Geldof and Bono, and you've given them a good call in this book. In fact, you've been called the anti-Bono.
Yes,
What's the matter with what they're doing?
Well, I think at least 3 things. First of all, I think they're fundamentally wrong to be calling for more aid to Africa. But second of all, they have a platform, and clearly many people, and a good following globally, and they choose to use that to push a negative image of Africa. They focus on what I call the 4 horsemen of Africa's apocalypse in the book. So they focus on war, poverty, disease, and corruption. And yet there's so many positive things that are happening. And an African woman said to me on my tour, how do they expect us to raise teenagers, young people in Africa with that type of imagery?
When they perpetuate that image, it's pretty hard for anyone want to invest.
Of course, but that's precisely the point. It's such a negative, all-encapsulating negative imagery that doesn't help in the long term to actually construct real societies. And then finally, I very much view the celebrity culture as an artifact of the aid regime itself, to the point where African governments have essentially taken a back seat, and they don't need to go out there and market themselves because, this has created a vacuum, and somebody else has stepped in as the celebrities. And it's a great shame that as a global community we think that is okay.
Do you worry at all you could be playing into the hands, given your fundamental premise, you could be playing into the hands of kind of the right-wing elements or miserly governments who, left to their own devices, would say, I'm not my other's keeper and have no interest?
Not at all. And I'll tell you why. Because the second half of the book is talking about ways in which we as a global society can actually meaningfully put a dent in Africa's poverty. This book is not saying that the Africa predicament is an African problem. This is actually a global problem. Africa currently, over 60% of the population is under the age of 24. If we don't do something dramatic to ensure that this young population has job opportunities, we'll have many more pirates, we'll have many more terrorists. And that affects everybody and the global construct. And so ultimately, this situation can be remedied only by the participation of all of us as a global community.
You do write also about the African countries being more welcoming to direct foreign investment.
Oh, absolutely.
And you also write about what China is doing in Africa in that regard. Tell me more about that.
Well, I think what the Chinese have done in the past decade in Africa has been absolutely tremendous. They have built roads, railways, ports, and laid down infrastructure in places that the West has failed to do in 60 years. The Pew survey, which is one of the think tanks in the United States, did a survey where they went to about 15 countries in Africa, probably with a cynical lens, I would imagine, and they surveyed people in these 15 countries, asking them a whole host of questions. I talk about this in the book. What do you think about the Chinese? Are they better or worse than the Americans? And so on. And consistently and by wide margins, Africans were very supportive of the Chinese in Africa.
Yeah, and that would be, that's surprising to a lot of people. What are they doing right? But the West doesn't
get. It's their attitude, it's their approach. They treat us as equals, at least in their minds, that they're coming to Africa to do business. They're not coming there for goodwill or under the auspices of guilt or pity, which is essentially what the aid model is predicated upon. and they come to do business. And in fact, even in their manner of doing business has changed quite dramatically over time. Originally, it was very much focused on natural resources. Now we're seeing them invest in the banking sector, in agriculture, and so on. And I think, yes, there are issues, certainly with respect to labor standards and environment, and governance. African governments need to be mindful of that. But it's a policy issue, and we need African governments to act on behalf of the African people. We don't need the Chinese to be managed by the international community. We are adults, and what's the worst-case scenario? We make mistakes as Africans, but we hold our governments accountable.
I was going to ask about that because of China's record in both environmental and humanitarian issues. I mean, we saw what happened in Sudan as an example, where China used its international leverage basically to stop United Nations intervention. I mean, should we be concerned about what China is doing in Africa?
Well, I think we should, as a global community, be concerned about China in general. The American government is borrowing from China. For some reason, we all get all wound up about it when we talk about Africa, but we seem to think it's okay for the Chinese government to buy
trillions of dollars.
Absolutely, to lend money to the United States government, but also to buy private companies in the United Kingdom and around the Western world. So I believe that there are other tools, maybe through the Security Council and other ways that perhaps we can bring China more on board with respect to governance issues. But I think to tell African governments or to encourage China not to go into Africa to invest, I think is incredibly selfish and intellectually dishonest.
You're not naive about this, though. I mean, you say that, you know, if China really does have a plan for world dominance, it's going to play out in Africa.
Oh, I think so. That is where, in terms of food security and arable land, I mean, China's got 1.3 billion people, 7% arable land. They need to feed their people.
And natural resources. I mean, few people really recognize how rich Africa is in natural resources.
That's right. In many of the key base metals, Africa is the largest producer, and we have the largest deposits. And yes, it should be a concern, but until we get African governments to act on behalf of African people, this is just conversation.
Your book is being, you know, received around the world, and to no one's surprise, the development community, who's got a pretty big vested interest in keeping the aid system going, have been screaming like mad. Among them, you know, Jeffrey Sachs, fairly well-regarded guy, he said, if we follow your prescriptions, there will be millions of lives lost. How do you respond to those people?
First of all, there have been millions of lives lost already in Africa because of the dishonesty of pushing an aid system, which, as I said earlier, has no evidence of ever working anywhere on earth in terms of reducing poverty in a meaningful way and creating long-term sustainable growth. I take particular issue with Professor Sachs because he taught me for a year, during which he very much was a proponent and a supporter of the combination of economic, sort of funding of economic development that I just talked about, trade and foreign direct investment, particularly with respect to Russia and Poland and Bolivia, very well known. So I think it is intellectually dishonest that now he's partnered with the celebrities to push an agenda, a new idea that he has never expressed as the way forward. And it does leave a bad taste in my mouth that, you know, this is the strategy that he's pushing, which is not, I believe, to be the right one.
You tell a very, very interesting kind of micro story to illustrate how aid can be a job killer rather than be unintended consequences. This is a story of the mosquito net maker in Africa. Relate that to our viewers.
Sure. So it's very simple. I've been in a number of international conferences where usually a vociferous Hollywood star stands up and screams, oh, we've got to give mosquito nets to Africans.
For malaria, of course.
For malaria, yes, which of course is a very serious problem across the continent. And people, you know, will dump mosquito nets that are made internationally into the African continent. But nobody ever stops to think that there are mosquito net producers on the African continent already, and very often by dumping free mosquito nets, you're putting them out of business. And more fundamentally, the question then becomes, why not use the money that you're using to buy the mosquito nets internationally? Why not invest that money so you can encourage the production of mosquito nets in Africa, and thereby creating jobs?
Yeah, you make the additional point that once the mosquito net manufacturer goes bankrupt, there's no one around to fix the nets when they get holes in them, as they invariably do.
Exactly.
On the why not, the other part of the stew that you're concocting here is trade liberalization. Again, especially for the Western world, to end their own farm subsidies. This has been a tough issue, you know, in all going back to GATT. I mean, how would this work?
try to be pragmatic about these things, and I think it's completely unrealistic for Africans and African governments to expect the markets to be open to them, Western markets, that is. And my prescription in the book is that African governments should stop wasting resources, so time and money, attending WTO meetings just for another round of chat, because fundamentally it is not in the interest of the American government or Western governments as a whole, European governments through the CAP, the Common Agriculture Policy, to get rid of the subsidies. It's in their interest. They need protectionism for their own people. And so my view is African governments should basically start to build alliances with those countries that need African produce. China, again, is a very good example of this, with, as I said, 1.3 billion people and 7% arable land.
More trade within Africa, too, I would think.
Absolutely. Where, by the way, it's still facing, countries sitting next to each other still have very high tariff barriers. In some cases up to 35%. This is not a formula for creating jobs and for encouraging trade.
Now, the one part of the equation that people have pointed to that looks, at least on the surface, to be making some real significant progress is all the antiviral work in terms of AIDS. I mean, AIDS is actually going down in Africa. Does that offer us a glimmer of, or a model, an illustration of AIDS can be used properly?
I believe, and I do sit on a charity that provides antiretrovirals in Africa, but I believe that the responsibility of education and health care, particularly in countries like my own where 1 in 3 people have HIV/AIDS, that responsibility is firmly on the shoulders of the African governments. It is not sustainable or desirable for us as a society to sit back in Africa and wait for donors and international community to provide us with healthcare and education, security and infrastructure. That is not sustainable, nor is it realistic. So yes, those type of interventions work and they're helpful. They're in the sense that they are a band-aid solution, but we've got a fundamental series of questions we should be asking. For instance, what happens in 10 years when those NGOs cannot provide HIV drugs to Africa? Do we have a contingency plan? What are African governments doing with the money that they've earned through the commodity boom? What is going to happen in years to come? Are African governments putting in place a plan to make sure that they are going to provide public goods to their people? These are the tough questions we need to ask. It's just not good enough for us to continue to beg or to wait for largesse from the international community to come to Africa.
Another problem you talk about, and we'll talk about the prescriptive side in a second, is the banking system in Africa, that there's a very underdeveloped banking system. I mean, one of the points you make is that even expats who are sending money home, that they've got to go through middlemen and lose 20 cents on the dollar, essentially. What can be done to strengthen the financial markets and the banking system in the African countries? Well,
here I'll draw on the work of Hernando de Soto, who is a Peruvian economist who's done some amazing work, primarily in his book called The Mystery of Capital. And his main central thesis is that these countries, particularly the most impoverished countries around the world, do not lack capital. They have money. The problem is that it's dead money. In the sense that
literally
it's dead capital. Exactly. It's sitting in a mattress, and very often because particularly the impoverished people, poor people in these communities do not have title or rights or ownership rights to their land or the assets that they use, the fundamental problem is that they cannot convert that asset that they hold, so the piece of land, into money that they can use to invest. And so I would say that Africa is, that's fundamentally one of the biggest problems in Africa, that we have a lot of amazing land. People are tilling the land, for example, but they also have cows and so on. And unfortunately, because there is this disconnect between the assets that they hold and their ability to collateralize those assets, we're in this cycle where we're not able to create that capital or make that capital live.
Like many others, you're a big fan of the whole concept and practice of microcredit.
Yes, that's right.
For our listeners who might not be familiar with it, first explain what that is, and again, how it could make a significant difference in Africa.
Sure. I mean, essentially, it's got many variations, but the fundamental idea is basically making relatively small loans, for, as I said, as little as $25, to impoverished entrepreneurs. So people who are starting businesses, you lend, I say, because that's the operative word, lend the money, and essentially through some kind of trust arrangement or through some kind of collateralization of their businesses, those people can pay the loans back. And this is met with incredible success. I mean,
and very, very low default rates. That's the thing I can't get over.
Incredibly low default rates, but more so, Muhammad Yunus, who I think most of us would call the godfather of microfinance, he won the Nobel Prize for his ingenious Grameen Bank in Bangladesh.
Right.
I was just with him a few months ago, and I was astounded to find out that even at the height of the credit crisis in 2008, he was able to raise $1 billion from poor people in Bangladesh.
An incredible pickup among women.
Absolutely. I think it's over 95% of his cohorts are women. And this is, it has challenges in terms of scalability and how much it can really move people out of poverty. So, for example, some people would argue if people are living on $1 a day, now maybe they're living on $5 a day. But you know what? It's the ingenious and the ingenuity and the innovation that somebody has come up with this that we need to focus on instead of just handing out money as we have in the traditional sense. And I just think it's such a remarkable tool to actually bring capital to most impoverished people around the world.
As I mentioned, I mean, the book's being sold and it's being talked about around the world. How is it being received in Africa?
Very positively, I'm happy to say. I think Africans in general are very interested to hear a new approach. I think we've had enough 60 years. As I said, we've got a very, very young population that's desperate to be part of the global society. I very much view myself as part of the lost generation of Africans. We unfortunately, are going to have suffered the consequences of the failure of our economic systems. And so we're really now talking about saving the next generation of Africans. I've had a number of meetings with African leadership, so a number of presidents across the continent, who are also very interested in seeing change.
There isn't a pushback among those who have a vested interest in the aid machine?
The greatest pushback that I've received is Western NGOs.
Is that right?
Yes. And in a way, they've used personal attacks. Jeffrey Sachs is a good example of that. They resort to personal attacks. They don't want to discuss ideas. And frankly, I mean, I think just purely on logic and evidence, we have every right as a global society to question the efficacy of the aid model. It has not made things better. And rather than have that debate, they choose to launch personal attacks, and it's a great tragedy.
You're living in London now. Would you go back to Africa to start the new banking system?
Absolutely. In a heartbeat. I mean, the reason why I live in London is because only by living in an international place, a hub like London, do I get the platform to be here, for example. The reality is if I had written this book and I was sitting in Zambia, I would have had no airtime. And I think these are ideas that we really need to have a debate about at a minimum. And I do think at a time when we have Obama in the White House and we've seen changes in the global economy, it's time to talk about a change to Africa.